The marble hallway had gone dead silent. Madame Yoon's voice cut through it like a blade dragged over glass. A temporary shadow doesn't get to sit at this family's table. Nandi Kumalo didn't flinch. She set down the folder she'd been holding, the one with 3 years of the syndicate's laundered numbers turned clean, and looked her mother-in-law directly in the eye. "Careful," she said quietly. "Shadows only disappear when the light does." Somewhere behind Madame Yoon, a guard's jaw tightened. Nobody moved. Nandi Kumalo, 27, South African, statuesque, dark waves falling past her shoulders, still damp from the storm rolling in outside. A white fitted dress, a single gold band she'd worn hidden on a chain for 2 years instead of her finger. She didn't carry herself like someone waiting to be forgiven for existing in that house. She carried herself like a woman who already knew the deed to the whole empire had her name typed into the ownership line. She just hadn't been allowed to say it out loud yet. Across the room, watching from the shadow of the doorway though no one had seen him arrive, stood Yoon Jae-hyun. Late 30s, dangerous stillness, an unbuttoned black shirt doing nothing to hide the ink crawling from his collarbone to his throat. The kind of tattoos a man only earns, never buys. He watched his wife being torn apart by his own mother the way a demolition expert watches a building he's already wired to fall exactly where he wants it to. What the family didn't know was that Jae-hyun had spent 11 days orchestrating this. Lawyers flown in under false names. A rival syndicate uprising that existed mostly on paper, just real enough to pull him out of the estate and give his mother the rope to hang herself with. Every account, every share, every brick of the empire, quietly re-signed into a trust with only one name on it. Not his, hers. Then came the call. The emergency. He kissed Nandi's forehead in the car, told her to hold the line no matter what happened while he was gone, and disappeared toward the airport. By the next evening, Madame Yoon had summoned the entire family under the guise of a syndicate meeting, and by the time the rain started, Nandi was being shoved toward the front doors of the estate she legally already owned. So what happens in the next 20 minutes, when a soaked, humiliated secretary turns around to find her husband standing in the doorway holding a black and gold binder with her name on it? Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment and let me know where you're watching from. I genuinely love to say hello and see just how far this story travels with all of you. The unease started small, the way rot always does. Not with a crash, but with a smell you keep telling yourself you imagined. Twice in 1 week, Jae-hyun noticed a black sedan he didn't recognize parked in the side lot reserved for family council, gone again before breakfast. His mother had started out of nowhere complimenting Nandi's dresses, asking after her family back home with a warmth that arrived only when someone has already decided, "You won't be around long enough for it to matter." Jae-hyun said nothing. In his family, the moment you let someone know you'd noticed a trap, they simply built a better one, and he had spent enough years in rooms far more dangerous than his mother's study to know exactly how a quiet, patient man could turn that same lesson back against the people who'd taught it to him. The tattoos climbing his chest and throat had each been earned in years he tried not to think about too often. A decade spent proving himself in the parts of the business his father never wanted him inheriting at all. Before his father's death put him in charge of an empire he'd spent every year since trying to drag, piece by reluctant piece, into something that could survive daylight. Legitimate holdings, real estate that could withstand an audit, a name that in another 10 years he hoped might be spoken in rooms that had nothing to do with the old violence at all. Nandi had done more for that transformation than any blood relative ever had, which made it, he thought, the particular cruelty of his family that the one person dragging them toward legitimacy was also the one his mother had decided, from the beginning, would never sit at the table where that legitimacy got celebrated. It came to a point on a Tuesday when Attorney Song, his mother's lawyer, a thin, meticulous man who had drafted 3 generations of Yoon wills and never once represented Jae-hyun directly, arrived for what the household calendar called a routine review of the trust documents. Jae-hyun had not been informed there was a review scheduled, which was, in itself, the kind of absence that told him something was already moving beneath the floor of his own house. He found the folder by the kind of accident a man engineers without quite admitting it. Song had stepped out of the study to take a call, leaving his briefcase open on the low table by the window, papers fanned just enough to catch the afternoon light. Jae-hyun did not go looking. He simply happened to be crossing the room when the crest on the top page stopped him cold. Dissolution of unrecognized marital claim. Beneath it, in the bloodless language lawyers use to make cruelty sound procedural, a plan to strike Nandi's name from every document that had ever quietly tied her to the family. Not through divorce, which would require admitting the marriage existed, but through a legal fiction that treated 2 years of his life as though they'd simply never been registered. His own name sat beside hers, and beside his name, a line already drafted for a signature he had never given. Ready, he understood, for the exact moment someone decided it was needed, forged or extracted. It wouldn't matter which. He didn't slam the folder shut. He photographed the page at a low, unremarkable angle, set it back exactly as he'd found it, same fold, same corner turned up 1/2 centimeter, and walked into the garden as though he needed air. Which, in the truest sense, he did. He did not confront his mother. Every instinct built over a decade of syndicate warfare told him to walk back in and end it. But he understood, with total clarity, that confronting her now would only teach her to hide the next attempt better. Better to let her believe she was winning. Better to give her exactly enough rope and be standing in the room when she used it to hang herself in front of everyone who mattered. He called Min-jun that night, from the far end of the garden where his own listening devices didn't reach. Min-jun had pulled him out of a burning warehouse in Incheon a decade ago, taken a falling beam across his own forearm to do it, and had spent every year since refusing to consider the debt repaid. He answered on the second ring. "I need everything moved," Jae-hyun said. "Every account, every share, every property outside the old family trust. New structure. One name on the controlling line. Whose? Nandi's." A pause, arithmetic rather than hesitation. "That'll take time to make it clean, not overnight. 11 days, Jae-hyun said, and it wasn't a request. By morning, 3 lawyers who had never appeared on any family payroll, men loyal to him alone, had begun the quiet architecture of it. Layer by layer the accounts moved, first into intermediate holding vehicles registered under names that meant nothing to anyone outside the small circle who'd built them, then into the final structure, each transfer timed and documented so that nothing would look, to any future auditor, like anything other than the ordinary housekeeping of a well-run family office. Nandi's own trusts, the ones she'd built herself to keep the family's dirtier money clean enough to survive an audit, became the scaffolding used to move everything into her name. There was something almost unbearable in the symmetry. The woman his mother wanted erased had built, without knowing it, the exact machine that would now make her untouchable. He signed everything at 2 in the morning with the study door locked and Nandi asleep 2 floors above, and he told himself the silence protecting her was mercy, in the particular hours when a man's justifications sound thinnest even to himself. The 11 days passed like a performance rehearsed without a script, each one indistinguishable from the last except for the particular flavor of dread Nandi carried through it without ever quite being able to name what caused it. 4 days in, Madame Yoon insisted on a family dinner none of them had asked for, the good china brought out, candles lit the length of the table as though there were something worth celebrating. She asked Nandi, with what looked almost like curiosity, about the small charity fund Nandi had quietly run for 2 years back in her hometown, a project she rarely mentioned, having learned that anything she cared about became, in Madame Yoon's hands, either a weapon or a joke. Nandi answered carefully, offering just enough to seem forthcoming without handing over anything that could later be twisted. Jae-hyun said little, refilled his mother's glass when it needed refilling, laughed once at a small joke one of the cousins made about the wine, and gave no sign that 3 nights earlier he'd signed away the entire foundation of the room they were sitting in. Nandi noticed his quiet more than she noticed anything his mother said that evening, filed it away, and told herself, as she'd told herself for 2 years, that whatever weighed on him would surface in its own time. He smiled at dinner. He let his mother refill his glass with the wine she reserved for victories. He watched her grow gentler toward Nandi, in exactly the way a woman grows gentle toward something she has already decided to discard. Once, at breakfast, Madame Yoon touched Nandi's hand and told her she looked tired, that she should rest more, take fewer of the family's burdens onto her narrow shoulders. As if concern and erasure could wear the same soft voice, and in his mother's mouth apparently, they could. Nandi noticed. She noticed everything, It was the very quality that had made her indispensable to him and dangerous to anyone who underestimated her. That night she sat at the edge of their bed and studied him the way she studied a column of numbers that didn't add up. Your mother's being kind to me, unusually kind. Is that so unusual? You know it is. She folded her hands in her lap. Jae-hyun, what's happening in this house? He wanted badly to tell her. He wanted to put the photograph in front of her and watch her take the plan apart, the way she took everything apart. Cold, surgical, precise. But if she saw the trap's shape before it closed, she would outmaneuver it quietly and rob his mother of the public reckoning she had more than earned. Some debts, he had decided, needed collecting in front of witnesses. Nothing you need to worry about, he said, and hated how easily the lie came, and kissed her forehead the way he always did when he meant something he couldn't yet say. The call from Busan came the next morning, almost on schedule, and it was real enough. A lieutenant in a rival line testing borders in his long absence. But timing, in his world, was a weapon like any other. He found Nandi folding a shirt that didn't need folding. The busy work of a woman keeping her hands occupied while her mind worked on something else. I have to go. How long? A few days, maybe a week. He crossed the room and kissed her forehead instead of answering the question underneath the question. Whatever happens while I'm gone, don't fight it. Let it happen. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He held her gaze a moment longer than he needed to, long enough that some part of him hoped she'd read in it everything he wasn't allowed to say out loud yet, and some part of him was relieved, in a way he wasn't proud of, when she didn't. She searched his eyes a long moment and made the decision, with the same discipline she brought to everything, not to push further. It was one of the things he loved most about her, and standing in that doorway, one of the things he found hardest to forgive himself for using. Before he left, he stopped by his grandmother's rooms, as he always did before any departure of more than a day. She was awake already, a cup of barley tea going cold in her hands, and she watched him a long moment before she spoke. You look like a man who has already decided something he hasn't told anyone yet. I have a rebellion to put down in Busan. That's not what I asked. Her eyes moved over his face with the thoroughness of a woman who had never once, in all his years, been successfully lied to by him. Whatever it is, be careful who you leave standing in this house while you're gone. Not everyone in it deserves to still be standing when you return. It was as close as she'd ever come to telling him she already knew something was wrong, and he decided, walking out to the car, not to ask how much she'd worked out on her own. Some allies were more valuable left to move on their own instincts. He left before dawn, Min-jun driving, the gates swinging open onto a sky the color of old bruises. In the car, Min-jun watched him in the mirror. You're really going to let it happen, all of it. I need her seen, Jae-hyun said. Not protected. My mother's convinced herself everyone in that house agrees with her, that the guards, the cousins, the elders all quietly think the same ugly thing she says out loud. I need every one of them to show me exactly who they are while they think there's no cost to it. Keep 2 men on the property, far enough she never sees them, close enough to move in seconds if it comes to that. If her life is in danger, they move. Nothing short of that. That's a narrow line to walk. It's the only one that gets me the truth. He watched the estate shrink in the side mirror until the hedges blurred into the gray of the morning and said nothing else for the rest of the drive, turning the shape of the coming days over in his mind the way another man might turn over a stone looking for the exact place it would split. By the time his plane was in the air, Madame Yoon had already begun making the calls that would gather the family. A general assembling troops before a battle she believed she'd already won, standing on ground that no longer belonged to her at all. She summoned Attorney Song within the hour, and Mi-rae not long after, and by evening the 3 of them sat together with the folder open on the table between them. You're certain the timing holds, Madame Yoon said. Not quite a question. He'll be in Busan at least a week, Song said. Long enough for the paperwork to be finalized before he returns. Good, she said, setting down her cup with a small, satisfied click. Then we do it properly, in front of the family. I want no one able to say afterward that it happened quietly, as though there were something to be ashamed of. She married into this family herself, 40 years earlier, a merchant's daughter with none of the bloodline the elders of that generation had wanted for their favored son, and she remembered, if she let herself, exactly what it felt like to sit at that same table, while her own mother-in-law recited a version of the same speech. She had told herself she would never become that woman. Somewhere in the long climb from that humiliation to the pearls she wore now, she had stopped asking whether becoming essential and becoming her mother-in-law had been the same transformation all along. If the thought crossed her mind that evening, she set it aside the way she had learned to set aside every inconvenient thought in 40 years inside these walls. The summons reached Nandi 2 days later, dressed as an emergency. A syndicate matter, the assistant told her over the phone, words clipped in a way that should have been warning enough. In 2 years she had never once been called to a family matter that didn't run through her husband first, and the fact that this one so pointedly did not, should have told her everything. The 2 days since Jae-hyun's departure had already left her uneasy in ways she couldn't quite name. A junior accountant who normally copied her on every filing had gone quiet without explanation. A meeting rescheduled twice by someone other than the officer himself. Small things, individually forgettable, but Nandi had built her career on the principle that static was rarely random. Still, 2 years of small insults absorbed quietly had worn a groove into her. The habit of assuming the worst that could happen was another cold dinner. She told herself it would be that, even as the sky outside deepened toward the gray that in that city always meant rain by evening, and found herself thinking, unbidden, of the first dinner she'd ever been invited to at that table, back before any of them knew there was more to her than a hired mind good with numbers. Madame Yoon spending an hour that evening asking pointed, honeyed questions about where exactly her people came from, whether the transition to a house with proper staff had been difficult to adjust to. Nandi had gone home and cried for exactly 1 hour, and never again in relation to that house, not once, not even on the nights that followed. 600 kilometers south, in a rented office above a Busan shipping terminal, Jae-hyun's phone lit up with a message from one of the men watching the estate. Summons issued. Full family present. She's on her way. He read it twice at the window. The gray water and container cranes outside utterly indifferent to what was riding on the next hour. The whole gray afternoon suddenly feeling very far away from the one room in the world he actually wanted to be standing in. Min Jun set down the folder of manifests they'd been reviewing. You could still call it off. And teach her exactly how far I was willing to let it go before I stepped in. Jae-hyun said, tell the men to keep their distance. Eyes only. He turned the phone face down on the sill, as though that might slow the next hour down. It didn't. For the rest of that afternoon he found himself reading the same line of figures on the manifests 3 and 4 times without absorbing a single number, his attention 600 kilometers away in a hall he could picture with unhelpful clarity. The estate looked, as it always did, like something built to be photographed rather than lived in. The long gravel drive lined with clipped hedges, the fountain running even now, indifferent to the weather gathering overhead, the pale stone facade glowing faintly gold against the darkening sky. Nandi had always found something almost funny about how carefully every hedge and light fixture had been arranged to suggest warmth, when so little of it had ever actually lived inside those walls for her. She stepped out under an umbrella one of the staff hurried to open and noted that his hand on the handle wasn't entirely steady. Nandi arrived to find the hall arranged like a courtroom that had already reached its verdict. She stepped into the hall thinking of the one thing Jae-hyun had told her before he left, don't fight it, let it happen, and found, standing at the threshold with every eye in the room already fixed on her, that she still didn't fully understand what he'd meant by it, only that some stubborn, trusting part of her had decided to obey him anyway, right up until the moment obedience stopped being possible. She had dressed that morning without any sense of occasion, a simple white dress, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, and it struck her only now, under the weight of every stare in that room, how deliberately the family arranged around her had dressed for a verdict while she alone had dressed for an ordinary Tuesday. The elders sat along the long lacquered table in their finest, backs straight, faces composed into a solemnity that required no explanation, because it had already been sanctioned by something larger than any of them. Her sister-in-law Mi-rae sat near the head, arms crossed, mouth curved into the satisfied expression of someone who has waited a long time to watch another woman fail. Uncle Byung-chul, gray-templed, one of the last men alive who remembered the family's bloodiest years, sat with his hands folded like a judge waiting for formalities to conclude. At the head of it all sat Madame Yoon, cream tweed suit pressed to a knife's edge, pearls gleaming under the chandelier, her hair pinned into the same tight, elegant updo she wore to every occasion that mattered to her, a folder in front of her like a weapon she'd spent 2 years sharpening. Along the walls behind the elders, the household syndicate guards stood in dark suits, backs rigid, faces schooled into the particular blankness men learn when they've decided survival depends on appearing to have no opinion at all about what they're watching. "Sit," she said, though no chair had been left near the table. Nandi remained standing. "I'll stand." "You will not sit," Madame Yoon went on, as though Nandi had agreed with her, "because what I have to say does not require your comfort. For 2 years you have worn this family's name like a costume you found in someone else's closet. A secretary playing house in a marriage that was never registered anywhere that matters, hidden away like something shameful. Because it is something shameful. It's registered," Nandi said, level, "in every jurisdiction that matters. You simply never bothered to look." A ripple moved through the elders, not sympathy, the discomfort of watching a servant forget her place. "You are not one of us," Madame Yoon said, her voice climbing now, gathering a momentum rehearsed for months in private bitterness, her hands trembling faintly against the folder, as though the words themselves cost her something to release. "You will never be one of us. Not your skin, not your blood, not the country you came from to attach yourself to my son's name and my family's fortune. I built this family's reputation over 40 years, and I will not watch it crumble because my son mistook convenience for love." "Convenience," Nandi repeated quietly, and let the word sit in the room a moment before she let it go, because she had learned long ago that repeating an insult back to the person who'd offered it, without heat, often did more damage than answering it directly ever could. "What else would you call it?" Mi-Ray cut in, leaning forward with the eagerness of someone who'd rehearsed her lines just as long. "A woman like you, from where you're from, with nothing, and somehow married to the heir of one of the most powerful families in the country, did you think we'd simply forget where you came from?" "I think," Nandi said, "you've spent 2 years hoping I'd forget it, so you'd have an excuse." Uncle Byung-chul leaned forward, his voice carrying the gravity of a man who believed age alone entitled his opinion to more weight than anyone else's. "A syndicate is not merely a business," he said, folding his heavy hands together on the table. "It is a treaty, renewed generation after generation, built on decades of trust between families who know exactly who they're dealing with. What message do we send our oldest partners, learning the heir's household finances run through a woman with no lineage anyone can verify? Nothing behind her but herself. Then it sends the message," Nandi said, turning to face him, "that your partner's loyalty was always conditional on things that have nothing to do with whether the books balance. If that's the treaty you're so afraid of breaking, it was never as solid as you told yourselves it was." A cousin near the far end of the table, younger, less certain than Mi-Ray, present more out of obligation than conviction, shifted uncomfortably and said nothing at all, which Nandi noted and filed away. The way she filed away every small hesitation in that room. "Enough of this," Madame Yoon snapped, sliding the folder across the table until it stopped short of Nandi's feet. "Sign it. Renounce the marriage, quietly, in a manner that protects what dignity you have left, and I'll see you compensated generously for your services to this family." The word landed exactly where it was meant to land, and the room went quiet, waiting to see whether it had done its work. Nandi didn't open the folder. "You want me to sign away a marriage," she said, "using a document drafted by a lawyer who apparently doesn't know the trusts holding this family's legitimate assets were restructured 18 months ago. By me. Filed through 3 holding entities your husband's old associates, set up to move money in ways none of you like to discuss at dinner." She let that sit a moment, watching it land on each face in turn. "There's a customs review scheduled for the shipping subsidiary next quarter. I could give you the exact date, the reviewing officer's name, the 3 ledgers she's already requested. Ask yourselves why no one else at this table can, and ask yourselves what happens to that review if my name disappears from every filing a week before she arrives." "You're bluffing," Mi-Ray said, though her voice had lost its certainty, and she glanced sideways at her mother as if hoping to find the old confidence still intact there, and finding, instead, a woman doing rapid arithmetic of her own. "Someone call Attorney Song," an elder said, and a phone appeared, and Song's voice came through tinny and unprepared. "The customs review," Madame Yoon said into it, testing whether the floor was as solid as she'd assumed. Explain how it's handled, and by whom. The pause on the line lasted longer than it should have. The current filings run through the restructured trust documents from last year, Song said carefully. Mrs. Kumalo's office prepared the majority of the supporting materials personally. I'd need to review the file before I could speak to who else has sign-off authority. The silence that followed was worse, for Madame Yoon, than any answer could have been. The silence of a woman realizing, in front of the exact audience she'd assembled to witness a triumph, that she'd walked in with far less certainty than she believed. Perhaps, one of the elders said carefully, we should table this until the filings can be properly reviewed. Sun Hee, Uncle Byung-chul said, using a familiarity Nandi rarely heard anyone risk. Perhaps we should. Enough. Madame Yoon's palm came down flat, sharp enough that the folder jumped an inch and the nearest teacup rattled in its saucer. Whatever calculation had flickered behind her eyes a moment ago was buried now under something more dangerous. The fury of a woman made, in front of witnesses, to feel exactly as unprepared as she was. I did not summon this family to be lectured by a woman hired to balance our books who decided that meant she'd earned a seat at our table. Get her out of my sight. Escort her from the estate. Along the wall the guard's rigid blankness cracked for just a moment. A shared, involuntary glance passing between two of them, the particular look of men recalculating, in real time, exactly how much of what they'd just heard they were going to be able to forget by morning. Two guards near the doorway exchanged a look before either moved, the flicker of men who understood exactly what had just been said and were no longer certain which order frightened them more. Now, Madame Yoon said, and they moved. Nandi didn't fight them. She let the two men take her by the arms, gently enough that it might have looked from a distance almost courteous, and let them walk her the length of the hall toward the front doors, chin level, spine straight, refusing to give the room the satisfaction of watching her come apart. The hall seemed longer walking out of it than it had walking in, the polished floor stretching ahead under the chandelier's cold light, every step measured, every step watched. Behind her, Mireille exhaled something that might have been relief or disappointment it hadn't gone further, and underneath it, the silence of elders who had watched everything and would say, later, they had done nothing wrong because they had done nothing at all. Near the doors, the younger of the two guards leaned in, quiet enough only she could hear. I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't agree with this. I know, she said, and meant it, and filed his face away with everything else that night. The kindnesses along with the cruelties, because both would matter eventually. Outside, through the tall glass doors, the sky had gone the color of wet slate, and in the distance the rain was already sweeping down toward the estate. It was the grandmother who moved first. She had sat through all of it in silence at the far end of the table, hands folded in her lap, her pale silk hanbok, the only soft thing in a room built entirely of hard angles. No one expected her to speak. Her silence over the years had been read, conveniently, as agreement, the natural deference of a woman who had long ago handed the running of the family over to younger, harder hands. She rose slowly, and the room quieted in a way it hadn't quieted for anyone else that evening. 40 years, she said, looking at her daughter. I have watched you mistake cruelty for strength. Her voice stayed soft, but it carried. You have humiliated a woman smarter than everyone at this table combined, in front of guards who will remember this evening long after you've forgotten it. Few people in that room remembered, or had ever been told, that the old woman had arrived into this family in circumstances not so different from the ones being used against Nandi tonight. A fisherman's daughter from the southern coast, married north to settle a debt her own father owed a Yoon elder 3 generations gone. She remembered her own mother-in-law's voice in rooms like this one, telling her she would never truly belong. She had said nothing, for most of 60 years, because saying something had never once changed the outcome for the woman it was meant to protect. Tonight, watching Nandi stand exactly where she herself had once stood, something in her had finally, quietly, decided that silence had run its course. Grandmother. The old woman turned her back on her before she could finish. It was a small gesture. To anyone unfamiliar with the grammar of that house, it might have looked like nothing, but everyone at that table understood exactly what it meant. In a household built on hierarchy and deference, turning your back on someone mid-sentence was as final, in its own quiet way, as slamming a door. Bring my car around, she said, already moving toward the entrance where Nandi stood between the guards, the glass doors ahead fogged now with the first real gust off the drive. the household lights flickering faintly against the wind picking up outside. "She'll ride with me." For a moment it seemed it might truly be that simple. The old sedan pulled up with unusual speed, and Nandi let herself be guided toward it, one hand gripping the strap of her bag like the last solid thing left in a world that had tilted entirely off its axis. Behind them, in the doorway, Madame Yoon watched her own mother-in-law choose Nandi in front of an audience she herself had assembled, and something in her face moved through a rapid, ugly succession. Disbelief first, that the one person in that house whose approval she had spent decades quietly craving would hand it instead to the woman she'd just spent an hour trying to erase. Then humiliation, sharp and unfamiliar, the sting of being outranked in front of witnesses she herself had gathered, and finally, settling over both like a lid closing on a pot left too long on the heat, a fury that needed somewhere immediate to go. Mireille opened her mouth as if to offer some word of reassurance, then, reading her aunt's expression correctly, thought better of it. "The gates stay closed," she called out, her voice carrying over the rising rain to the checkpoint at the end of the drive. "No car leaves this estate tonight until I say so." The sedan slowed at the gatehouse, brake lights smearing red across wet gravel, and through the fogged window Nandi watched the guards there exchange the same hesitation as before, except sharper now, because there was no ambiguous order left to hide behind. "Let her through," the grandmother said, leaning forward. "I can't, ma'am," the nearer guard said, clearly unhappy to be saying it. "Not without word from Madame Yoon herself. And she's just said—" "I don't answer to Madame Yoon," the grandmother said, sharper now than Nandi had ever heard her. "Open the gate." The guard's eyes flicked toward the house, toward the figure of Madame Yoon still visible in the lit doorway, and Nandi understood, watching him hesitate, that she was about to become the reason two loyal men lost whatever peace they had left in that job, whichever way this went. Nandi rested her hand against the door before he could finish. "Don't," she said quietly, to the grandmother, to the driver, mostly to some last stubborn part of her own chest that wanted very badly to be driven away from all of it. "I won't make these men choose between the two of you tonight. Let me finish this the way I started it, on my feet." She stepped back out into the rain before anyone could argue, closing the door behind her with a gentleness that felt, in that moment, like the last calm thing she had left to give away. Through the water streaking the glass, the old woman's face was unreadable in a way Nandi wouldn't understand until much later. Not defeat, but patience. The certainty of a woman who had already set something far larger than one locked gate into motion. In rooms none of the people gathered in that hall even knew existed. Nandi turned back toward the house, toward Madame Yoon standing triumphant in the lit doorway, and began walking into the storm on her own 2 feet, exactly the way she intended to leave it, upright, soaked through within seconds, her hair plastered to her shoulders, her dress to her skin, the bag growing heavier with every stride across the gravel. She did not look back a second time. She had learned over 3 years in that house that looking back was a currency too, and she was not willing to spend any more of it on a woman who had never once earned it. The rain came harder the farther she walked, the mansion's lights shrinking behind her into a smear of gold, the long drive stretching ahead toward gates ordered shut against her as surely as the doors behind her had been ordered open. Thunder rolled over the hills, distant enough to feel more than hear. A low pressure against her chest that matched, almost exactly, the pressure already sitting there. Somewhere behind her, faintly, she thought she heard the sound of the front doors closing again, the house sealing itself back up around whatever satisfaction Madame Yoon imagined she'd earned tonight, and Nandi found she didn't have it in her to look back and confirm it. She thought of every quiet insult absorbed over 3 years in exchange for a peace that had just proven, tonight, to have never really existed. She thought of Jae-hyun, 600 kilometers away, and wondered for the first time whether let it happen had ever meant what she'd assumed, or whether he had known something about tonight she hadn't been permitted to know. Her leather bag had gone heavy with rainwater, her arm aching from the weight of it, and still she didn't set it down, because setting it down would have meant admitting, even to herself, that she needed to rest before she reached wherever it was she was walking to. She did not slow down. She did not let the rain, or the cold, or the particular ache settling into her chest change the pace of her steps even slightly, and she was still walking, still upright, still unbroken, when the first set of headlights swept around the bend at the bottom of the drive. Far too many headlights, far too much weight in the engines carrying them, moving toward the estate with the unmistakable authority of vehicles that had never once needed to slow for a closed gate. She stopped where she stood, rain running in sheets down her face, and watched them climb the long hill toward her, engines low and patient, the kind of patient that belonged only to men who already knew exactly how the next 10 minutes were going to end. Whatever was arriving behind those lights, she understood. Watching them close the distance through the sheeting rain, it was arriving for her. And for the first time all evening, standing soaked and shaking at the center of that long dark drive, Nandi allowed herself to hope. The convoy took the last curve of the drive without slowing, and by the time the lead car's headlights swept full across her, Nandi understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with 3 years of learning the particular sound of his engines, that it was Jae-hyun. He was out of the car before it had fully stopped, closing the distance between them in long strides that didn't so much as glance toward the house, toward his mother, toward any of the faces now crowding the lit doorway to see what the noise was. He didn't say her name, he didn't ask if she was hurt, didn't waste a single second on anything that could wait. He simply reached her, put himself between her and the wind coming off the hills, and turned to face the house with an expression Nandi had seen only twice before in 3 years. The particular stillness that meant something in him had already decided how the next few minutes were going to go, and nothing in that doorway was going to change it. Madam Yoon's voice cracked across the drive first, somewhere between fury and disbelief. "You're supposed to be in Busan." "I was." He didn't raise his voice to match hers. He never needed to. He reached into his coat and produced a thick black binder, its cover embossed in gold, and held it out toward Nandi, rather than his mother, close enough that everyone gathered in that doorway could see exactly what it was and exactly who it was for. The choice situation resolved itself faster than expected. Convenient, since I had somewhere else I needed to be tonight. Madam Yoon's eyes fixed on the binder, and Nandi watched something in her face fight to keep its composure and lose. "What is that?" "The family deed," Jae-hyun said, and turned it in his hands so the gold lettering caught the light from the house. "Every property, every legitimate holding, every share of every company that carries this family's name, transferred, 11 days ago, into a trust with one name on the controlling line." He looked at his mother for the first time since stepping out of the car, and his voice, when it came, was almost gentle, which made it so much worse than shouting would have been. "Not yours, not mine, hers." The syndicate guards along the drive had gone rigid, the particular rigidity of men recalculating, in real time, exactly whose orders they answered to now. Behind them, framed in the warm light of the open doors, several of the cousins who had sat through the tirade 2 nights earlier stood frozen mid-motion, one of them still holding the umbrella he'd forgotten to open against a rain that had already soaked through his shoulders. Myre's hand had risen to her mouth, and Uncle Byung-chul, standing just behind her, said nothing at all, though Nandi caught the particular way his eyes moved from the binder to his sister-in-law's face and back again, doing arithmetic he clearly wished he'd started sooner. Somewhere behind them all, framed in the warm light of the open doors, the grandmother sat exactly where she had refused to leave her seat, hands folded in her lap, and though her face gave up nothing, Nandi understood, meeting her eyes across the wet gravel, that she was the only person in that doorway who wasn't surprised. Madam Yoon lunged forward, not far. The guards caught her before she'd taken more than a step, though it didn't stop her reaching, her hand grasping at empty air a foot short of the binder's edge, fingers closing on nothing but rain. "You would humiliate your own mother in front of the entire family. Over her, over that woman." "I would," Jae-hyun said, "and I have, and it's done." He pressed the binder gently into Nandi's hands, folding her cold fingers around it with his own, and for just a moment his terrifying calm cracked into something only she was close enough to see. Relief. Raw and unguarded. The look of a man who had spent 11 days rehearsing this exact sentence and still hadn't been sure, until this moment, that he'd be in time to say it. Behind him, one of the older guards, a man who had served the household for longer than Jae-hyun had been alive, lowered his eyes and, very quietly, very deliberately, inclined his head toward Nandi in a gesture that had nothing to do with any order given aloud. "There's more to finish tonight than I can finish standing in this rain," Jae-hyun said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. My grandmother's estate in the valley. Go there, rest. I need to close what's still open here, and I need you steady enough to sign what comes next when it comes." She wanted, more than almost anything, to stay and watch his mother's face finish collapsing. But she recognized the particular weight in his voice. Not a request exactly, but close enough to one that she trusted it. She let Min-jun guide her toward the second car, the black binder held against her chest like something that might, if she loosened her grip even slightly, turn out to have been a dream. She had spent 3 years imagining, in her more exhausted moments, what it might feel like to finally stop having to prove herself to a house that had decided long before it met her exactly how little she was worth. And she found, sitting in the back of that car as the estate's lights receded behind her, that the feeling bore almost no resemblance to the triumph she'd occasionally allowed herself to picture. It felt instead like the particular exhaustion of setting down something impossibly heavy after carrying it so long the muscles had forgotten what it was to move without the weight of it. Min-jun found him still standing in the rain a few minutes after the second car had disappeared down the drive with Nandi inside it, watching the lit windows of the mansion the way a man watches a fire he's decided, for reasons of his own, not to put out just yet. "You could go back in there right now and finish it," Min-jun said. "Freeze every account tonight. Have Song drawing up the eviction papers before sunrise." "I could," Jae-hyun agreed. "But my mother's spent 40 years believing she's the only one in this family clever enough to win a long game. I want her to spend one more night proving me right about exactly how short her patience actually is." He watched a shape move past one of the lit windows. His mother, he assumed, already gathering the family back around her, already rebuilding the story she'd tell herself before the sun came up. Let her celebrate tonight. Let her convince the rest of them it was a bluff. Whatever she does with that false comfort between now and morning will tell me more about who in that house is worth keeping than any conversation I could have with them directly. A man who confronts his enemy the moment he's won only learns what his enemy says when she's frightened. I'd rather learn what she does when she thinks no one's still watching. He turned finally and walked back to his own car. "Have someone watching, quietly. I want to know everything they do with the hours they think they still have." The Valley estate sat an hour outside the city, low and quiet, tucked into a fold of hills that kept the worst of the storm from reaching it. By the time the car pulled up the gravel path, the rain had thinned to something almost gentle, and the house itself glowed with the particular warmth of a place that had never once needed to perform welcome for anyone, because it had never had anything to hide. Min-jun walked her to the door without a word, the way he did most things, and only at the threshold did he pause long enough to say, quietly, "He'll come when he can. He asked me to tell you that specifically, in case you didn't believe it from anyone else." Nandi nodded, too exhausted to trust her own voice with an answer, and watched him return to the car and disappear back down the gravel path into the dark. She stood in the entryway for a long moment after the car pulled away, the black binder still pressed to her chest, and found that her legs, which had carried her the length of that long drive without faltering, had finally decided the performance was over. The house around her was unfamiliar in the particular way that all of Jae-hyun's family properties were unfamiliar to her. Beautiful, quiet, entirely unearned by anything she'd personally done to belong in it, though tonight, for the first time, she understood that the deed in her arms had made that distinction obsolete before she'd even had time to feel it. She made it as far as the small guest room at the end of the hall, plain, unassuming, nothing like the estate's marble excess, before the tears came, and once they started she found she couldn't have stopped them if she'd wanted to. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still in her ruined dress, rain still dripping from the ends of her hair onto the wooden floor, and cried the way she hadn't let herself cry in 3 years, not from the humiliation of the tirade, not even from the terror of the storm, but from the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of having held herself upright through every single second of it, in front of every single person who wanted her broken, without once letting them see it cost her anything. She cried for the version of herself who had sat through that first dinner 3 years ago and decided dignity was something you built quietly, rather than something you were owed. She cried, a little, even for Madame Yoon, for the particular loneliness of a woman who had spent 40 years mistaking cruelty for the only kind of strength available to her. She let it cost her something now, alone, with no one watching, and found that the room didn't judge her for it. and that this, more than the deed still sitting heavy in her lap, felt like the first real proof that the night was actually, finally, over. She didn't hear the door open. It was the grandmother's voice, soft and unhurried, that told her she wasn't alone anymore. "You've earned every one of those," the old woman said, settling into the chair by the window without ceremony, as though she'd done it 100 times before, in this exact room, for other women in other kinds of trouble. "Cry as long as you need to. There's no one here keeping score of it." Nandi wiped her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed despite herself. "I didn't expect you to come all this way tonight. I own this house," the grandmother said simply. "I go where I like in it, and there are things I need to show you before the sun comes up. Things that won't wait politely for you to finish grieving a night that deserved every tear you've just given it." She reached into the folds of her hanbok and produced a slim leather folio, considerably less ceremonial than the binder Jae-hyun had carried, and set it on the small table between them. "This is the part of tonight my grandson doesn't know I've already started." Nandi looked at the folio, then at the old woman's face, searching for the particular stillness she'd learned to read in Jae-hyun, and finding, instead, something sharper. The expression of a woman who had spent decades being underestimated, and had built, in that underestimation, a set of skills nobody in that family had ever bothered to notice. "There's a second document," the grandmother said, opening the folio to the first page. "The deed you're holding transfers ownership. It doesn't, on its own, freeze anything. It simply changes whose name sits at the top of the ledger, which is a symbolic thing, a legal thing, but not, by itself, a thing that stops a woman like my daughter from spending money that technically isn't hers anymore before the courts have finished sorting out what that even means. This," she tapped the folio, "does the rest. Every account this family operates through, household, corporate, the shell structures your husband thinks I don't know about, routes, as of tonight, through a single authorization, yours. Sign this, and by morning, not one card in that house will clear a single transaction without your name attached to the approval." Nandi studied the pages in front of her, the careful architecture of it. 3 separate signature lines, each requiring her name in a different capacity. Trustee, controlling member, sole authorized signatory, and understood, reading it, that this was the true weapon, far quieter than the binder, far more absolute than a declaration made in a rainstorm no matter how dramatic the delivery had been. "You built this." "I helped build it," the grandmother said. "Your husband's lawyers did the architecture. I simply made sure the paperwork moved through channels my daughter has never learned to watch, because she has spent 40 years assuming an old woman who pours tea and says little couldn't possibly be doing anything more dangerous than embroidery." Something almost fond crossed her face, briefly, and vanished. "It's a useful thing to be underestimated by people who should know better. I recommend it, if you ever find yourself in need of a quiet weapon again." Won't she fight it? In court? Or through whoever she still has left willing to listen to her? "She'll try," the grandmother said, without much concern. "But she'll be trying with lawyers whose own retainers, as of tonight, also run through accounts you control. There's a particular kind of loyalty that evaporates the moment the paycheck stops clearing, and I've watched it evaporate in this family more times than I care to count." She slid a pen across the table. "You don't have to sign tonight. You could wait until morning, until you've slept, until the shock has had time to settle." "No?" Nandi picked up the pen before she'd finished deciding to. Her hand, she noticed, had stopped shaking. "I've waited 3 years to stop being patient in this family. I'm not waiting until morning to finish it." She signed each line in turn, her name settling onto the page in the same steady hand she used for every ledger she'd ever balanced. And when she set the pen down, the grandmother gathered the folio with the quiet efficiency of a woman closing a door that had needed closing for a very long time. "Get some sleep," the old woman said, rising. "Whatever's happening back at that house tonight, it will still be happening in the morning, and you'll want to be rested enough to enjoy watching it." Nandi slept longer than she'd expected to, the particular deep, dreamless sleep of a body that has finally been given permission to stop bracing, and woke to pale winter light coming through unfamiliar curtains and the sound, faint and comforting, of someone moving quietly in a kitchen down the hall. She found the grandmother already at the small table by the window, a pot of barley tea between them, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, content to let the quiet of the valley do the talking neither of them needed to do out loud. You'll want to know what's happening at the house, the grandmother said eventually, sliding a cup across the table. I imagine I'll find out soon enough either way. You will. The old woman studied her over the rim of her own cup. For what it's worth, I don't think you need to rush back to watch it unfold. There's a particular satisfaction in letting a thing finish on its own schedule rather than standing over it, willing it faster. She set the cup down. I spent 60 years learning that lesson later than I should have. I'd rather you learn it now, while it can still do you some good. Nandi wrapped both hands around the warm cup and thought, not for the first time that morning, of the version of herself who had walked into that hall 2 nights earlier, prepared to defend a marriage, instead of announce an inheritance. Do you regret it, staying quiet all those years? The grandmother considered the question longer than Nandi expected her to. Every day, she said finally, but regret is only useful if it changes what you do next, and I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure it does. She reached across the table and briefly covered Nandi's hand with her own, a small gesture, entirely unlike her usual reserve, and gone again almost before Nandi had time to register it. Eat something. Whatever's coming for that family today, you'll want your strength for it, and not the kind that comes from an empty stomach and old grievances alone. What was happening back at that house, at that particular hour, was a kind of celebration. Madame Yoon had retreated from the drive in a fury too large to sit still with, and by the time the family reconvened in the main hall an hour later, wine already open on the sideboard, the story being told among them had reshaped itself into something more bearable than the truth. Jae-hyun's declaration, Mi-rae assured anyone who would listen, had been exactly what it looked like. A man momentarily unmoored by guilt, making an emotional gesture in a rainstorm that meant considerably less on paper than it had sounded standing in the doorway. Trusts could be contested. Deeds could be challenged in court, especially deeds signed by a man clearly not thinking with his better judgment. One of the younger cousins, a nephew barely out of university who had said nothing at all during the tirade 2 nights before, ventured that perhaps they ought to wait and see what the morning brought before doing anything they couldn't take back, and was met with such a withering look from his aunt that he found somewhere else in the room to be for the rest of the evening. By the time the second bottle of wine had been opened, the room had talked itself into believing that the crisis of that evening was, in fact, a temporary embarrassment rather than a permanent defeat, and Madame Yoon, nursing her wounded pride with a glass in each hand, decided the family deserved something to mark the moment they'd taken their house back from the woman who'd nearly stolen it. Clear her things out, she said, to no one in particular, and everyone at once. Tonight, I want no trace of her left in this house by morning, whatever paper my son thinks he's signed. She raised her glass then, to the room rather than to anyone in particular, and said, with a conviction that would look, in hindsight, almost unbearably foolish, to a family that remembers who it belongs to. A ragged chorus of glasses answered her, though Nandi would learn later that at least 2 of the elders at that table had raised theirs without much enthusiasm, already privately uneasy about a celebration that felt, even as they joined it, less like victory and more like the last loud noise a losing side makes before the silence sets in. It started, as these things do, with small cruelties that grew bolder the longer no one stopped them. Mi-rae was the one who found the box of wedding photographs first, the quiet registry office wedding neither of them had ever shown anyone. Photographs Nandi had kept hidden in the back of a closet, precisely because she'd understood, better than Jae-hyun ever had, how little safety that marriage had actually been afforded inside these walls. Mi-rae held one up to the firelight, the 2 of them barely visible in the ugly fluorescent glow of a government office 2 hours outside Seoul, and laughed in a way that had nothing of humor in it. Look how small she made herself, she said, passing it around. Even her own wedding, and she couldn't manage to look like she belonged in it. The photographs went into the fireplace one at a time, deliberately, the way people destroy things they want witnessed rather than simply discarded. Uncle Byung-chul, watching from a chair near the door, opened his mouth once as though he meant to object, then closed it again, and Nandi would learn later that he had left the room shortly after, unwilling to put his own hands to the task, but equally unwilling to be the one man in that family to say aloud that something about the evening had gone somewhere none of them should have followed it. Madame Yoon, for her part, felt something small and cold move through her as the last photograph curled at the edges. Not quite doubt, not yet, but close enough to its shape that she reached for her wine glass rather than sit with it a moment longer, and told herself, the way she had told herself for 40 years whenever a similar feeling surfaced, that hesitation now would only be mistaken for weakness by everyone watching her decide. Nandi's clothes were pulled from the wardrobe in her old room and thrown into a pile in the hallway, her books swept off the shelf. A small framed drawing a child in her charity program had once sent her torn cleanly down the middle by Mireille's manicured hands and left on the floor for someone else to sweep away. Madame Yoon watched most of it from a chair near the fire with the particular satisfaction of a woman rebuilding, piece by burning piece, a version of the evening she could actually stand to remember, and told herself, with every photograph that curled and blackened in the flames, that this was strength reasserting itself rather than the last ugly gasp of something already finished. None of them, in the warm, firelit hour of their small, vindictive triumph, thought to check their phones for the notification that had already gone out from the family's primary bank, quietly, at 11 minutes past midnight, informing every cardholder on every account associated with the Yoon household that their authorization status had been updated pending review. Morning arrived the way mornings do after a night no one in that house had actually slept through. Gray light easing over hills still wet from the storm, and it was Mireille, predictably, who discovered the first sign of it, standing at the coffee counter of a shop 3 blocks from the estate, mortified, as her card was declined twice in front of a line of impatient commuters. She called the house in a fury before she'd even paid cash for her coffee, certain it was some clerical error at the bank, some inconvenience that would resolve itself with one phone call to the right person. It did not resolve itself. By 9, the household accounts manager was standing in Madame Yoon's study with a face the color of old paper, explaining that every card associated with the family's name, the household accounts, the driver's fuel stipend, the corporate cards issued to 3 separate executives, even the small discretionary account Madame Yoon kept for her own private spending, had been declined or frozen sometime overnight, and that his calls to the bank had gone nowhere, their compliance department citing an authorization change filed and executed under trust protocols he wasn't cleared to discuss. One of the household drivers, sent to fill the fleet's tank before the morning's errands, returned an hour later having been turned away at the pump, the station's card reader flatly refusing the account number he'd used without incident for 6 years. By mid-morning, 3 separate deliveries, groceries, dry cleaning, a shipment of imported wine Madame Yoon had ordered weeks earlier and forgotten about, arrived at the gate and were sent back for lack of payment, each small refusal landing with the particular sting of a door quietly closing somewhere no one had thought to check. "Call attorney Song," Madame Yoon said, her voice thinner than it had been the night before. "Call him now." Song's voice, when it finally came through, carried none of the confidence it had carried at that long table 2 nights earlier. He had reviewed what he could access, he said, carefully. The way a man chooses his words when he suspects the person on the other end of the line is no longer the one he actually answers to. The trust restructuring appeared, on its face, to be entirely legitimate, filed, notarized, executed through channels that predated even the confrontation in the rain by nearly 2 weeks. Whatever authority Madame Yoon believed she still held over the household's finances had, as far as he could determine, already been quietly, comprehensively removed before she'd ever called that family meeting at all. "That's not possible," Madame Yoon said, and heard, even as she said it, how much less certain the words sounded than they had a day earlier. "There's something else," Song said, more carefully still. "A second filing went through this morning. Personal authorization, tied to Mrs. Kumalo's signature, dated last night. I don't have the details of what it covers. I wasn't given access. Plus, the fuel stipend that kept the household's fleet of cars running went next. A curt notice arriving by email that the account had insufficient standing authorization to process the month's allocation. By noon, the staff who ran the estate's kitchens and grounds had begun quietly asking each other, in the particular hush of people who suspect they're about to be caught in the middle of something they didn't sign up for, whether payroll was still coming at the end of the week, and no one in the family had an answer that sounded like more than a guess. By early afternoon, one of the elder cousins tried, and failed, to withdraw cash directly from a branch across town and return to the estate white-faced, having been told, quietly and apologetically, by a teller who clearly recognized the family name and clearly wished she didn't have to be the one delivering the news that the account in question no longer listed him as an authorized party of any kind. Madam Yoon spent the better part of that day making calls that went nowhere, to bankers who suddenly couldn't be reached, to a lawyer whose confidence had visibly drained out of him overnight, to a son who did not pick up his phone even once. In the early evening, unwilling to sit with the growing dread any longer, she'd had her driver take her personally to the jeweler on the estate's account, some old instinct telling her that surrounding herself with the trappings of the life she still believed she controlled might steady her nerves better than another unanswered phone call would. The card declined there too, in front of a clerk who recognized her name and grew visibly uncomfortable trying to explain, delicately, that there was nothing more he could do. She stood in that shop a long moment, pearls she'd already quietly sold sitting absent from her throat, and understood, in a way no phone call had managed to make her understand, exactly how completely the ground beneath her had already given way. By the time evening came, she understood, with a clarity she would have given almost anything to avoid, that the humiliation in the rain had not been the wound, it had only been the announcement of one. They arrived the next afternoon without any of the theater of 2 nights before. No convoy sweeping up the drive, no storm to punctuate the moment, just a single black car pulling up quietly at the front steps while pale winter light lay flat across the wet gravel. Jae-hyun stepped out first and offered his hand to Nandi, who wore, this time, not the ruined white dress but a dark tailored coat that belonged entirely to a woman who had come to conduct business rather than survive an ambush. Behind them, a second car brought the grandmother, who made her way up the steps unhurried, exactly as she had made her way out of them 2 nights earlier, as though she had simply been away on an errand and was now returning to see how the house had managed without her. The family had gathered in the main hall again, not because anyone had summoned them this time, but because there was nowhere left in the house that felt like it belonged to them more than the hall did, and some old instinct had pulled them there anyway, the way people gather in the room where the news is worst. Mi-rae stood near the window with her arms wrapped around herself, the confidence of 2 nights earlier entirely gone from her posture. Uncle Byung-chul had taken a seat rather than standing this time, an old man's concession to a day that had already asked more of him than he'd expected to give. Madam Yoon stood near the cold fireplace, the ash of 2 nights burning still faintly visible in the grate behind her, and Nandi noted, walking in, that her mother-in-law's pearls were gone, sold perhaps, or simply set aside by a woman no longer certain what dignity was worth spending on an audience that had already seen everything. "You've had a difficult 2 days," Jae-hyun said, and there was no cruelty in it, which somehow made it land harder than cruelty would have. "I imagine by now Attorney Song has explained what he can. I'll explain the rest." He set the black binder on the long table, opened it to the pages the family had never been permitted to actually read 2 nights earlier, and let them see, for the first time, the full architecture of what had already been true for 11 days before anyone in that room had ever raised their voice about it. Every filing is legitimate. Every signature is verified. There is no court in this country that will unwind a trust this cleanly executed, and I'd advise against spending what little money you have left trying to prove otherwise. "This is my house," Madam Yoon said, though the words came out smaller than she intended them to. "It was," Nandi said, and stepped forward for the first time since entering the hall, her voice carrying none of the heat she might once have needed to make herself heard in that room. "It's mine now. Every brick of it, every account that runs through it, every guard standing along that wall." She let her gaze move deliberately across the room, Mi-rae, who wouldn't meet her eyes, Uncle Byung-chul, who at least had the composure to look ashamed, the guards along the wall, who straightened, almost imperceptibly, the way men do when they've already decided, somewhere in the last 2 days, whose orders they intend to follow from now on. "I spent 3 years being told I didn't belong in this family. I'm not interested in spending the next 30 proving I do. I'm simply going to run it." Madam Yoon's eyes moved, wild for a moment, toward the folder on the table, then toward her son, as though searching for some crack in his composure she could still exploit. "Jae-hyun, look at what she's done to us in 2 days. Imagine what she'll do with 30 years. "I have imagined it," Jae-hyun said, and something in his voice made it clear the answer had settled long before this afternoon. It looks a great deal like a company that passes its audits, a family that stops needing to fear a knock on the door, and a house where the people working under this roof are finally paid on time by someone who actually understands where the money comes from and where it goes. I imagine it looks like the family we could have been, if we'd been willing to let her build it from the start instead of forcing her to build it in secret. You're choosing her over your own blood. I'm choosing the person who kept this family out of prison for 2 years, while the rest of you were busy deciding she wasn't good enough to sit at your table, Jae-hyun said, and for the first time since walking into the hall, something colder moved through his voice. That's not a difficult choice, Mother. It never was. You simply never once bothered to ask me which way I'd already made it. Mireille, still by the window, found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than the version of it that had spoken so easily 2 nights before. What happens to the rest of us? Nothing you haven't already decided for yourselves, Nandi said, not unkindly. Anyone in this family who's willing to work under the terms I set can stay and draw a salary like everyone else who works for this company. Anyone who isn't is welcome to leave with whatever severance the courts would consider fair, and not 1 cent more. She looked, briefly, at Uncle Byung-chul, whose objection 2 nights earlier, however quiet, she hadn't forgotten. Some of you have already shown me which kind of family member you intend to be. I'll be watching to see which the rest of you choose. She turned to Madame Yoon last, and something in her voice, when she finally addressed her directly, was quieter than anything she'd said in that hall 2 nights before. Not gentler exactly, but far more final. You have until the end of the week to collect whatever belongs to you personally, and nothing that belongs to this family. After that, you're not welcome on this property, and I'll make sure every account, every card, every door in this house understands that, as clearly as I do. Madame Yoon's mouth opened, some last reserve of fury gathering itself for one more attempt. You cannot simply erase 40 years. I'm not erasing them, Nandi said. I'm ending them. There's a difference, and I think, if you're honest with yourself, for the first time tonight, you already know which one this is. She let the silence that followed sit a moment longer than was comfortable, the way she had learned to let silence do its own work in that very hall 2 nights before. You spent an evening asking me what right I had to any of this. I'll ask you something in return, and you don't have to answer it out loud. Just carry it with you when you leave this house for the last time. In 40 years of running this family, how many people in that hallway just now looked at you the way they looked at me tonight? Not out of fear, out of respect they chose to give, rather than respect you demanded. She looked around the hall at the faces that had already stopped looking to Madame Yoon for permission, and found there was nothing left in the room willing to carry the older woman's fury for her, not even out of habit. The grandmother, seated now at the head of the long table where she had once watched everything unfold in silence, allowed herself, for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, something that might almost have been called a smile. She had sat through so many versions of this family's cruelty over the decades, quietly cataloging each one, that watching the balance finally tip the other direction felt less like triumph and more like the closing of a very long account she'd never expected to see settled in her own lifetime. Sun-hee, she said, addressing her daughter with a gentleness that landed harder than any of the anger in the room had, you spent 40 years teaching this family that strength meant never once bending. I hope, wherever you land after this week, you'll finally let yourself learn what I never had the courage to teach you in time. That the ones who bend are usually the ones still standing at the end. Jae-hyun crossed the hall to stand beside his wife, close enough that their shoulders touched, and together they watched the last of Madame Yoon's authority leave the room the way water leaves a cracked vessel. Not all at once, but completely, and without any hope of being poured back in. It was the young guard, the one who had leaned in close enough at the doorway 2 nights before to tell her, quietly, that he didn't agree with what was happening, who approached Nandi first once the hall had begun to empty, the family drifting off in 2s and 3s to absorb, in whatever private way each of them needed, exactly how much the world had rearranged itself around them in the space of 3 days. He didn't say anything at first, simply inclined his head the way the older guard had done on the drive that first night, and Nandi found herself remembering his face from the rain, filed away exactly where she'd promised herself she would keep it. You said you didn't agree with it, she said. That night. I didn't, ma'am. Good. She held his gaze a moment longer, not unkindly. I'll need people around this house who are willing to say that kind of thing out loud, when it matters. Starting now, that's part of what I'm paying for." She turned to find the household accounts manager still hovering near the door, uncertain whether he still had a job or simply hadn't been told yet that he didn't, and softened, slightly, seeing the exhaustion in his face. "Payroll goes out on schedule this week, in full, starting with the staff who've had the worst 3 days of anyone in this house, through no fault of their own. See to it personally." By the time she and Jae-hyun stepped back out onto the front steps, the afternoon light had shifted toward evening, the same hills that had swallowed the storm 2 nights earlier now settling into an ordinary, unremarkable dusk, as though the house itself had already begun forgetting how dramatically its fortunes had turned. The grandmother lingered a moment longer in the doorway behind them, watching the family disperse through the halls of a house that would, by the end of the week, belong to a version of itself none of them had ever expected to answer to. "You did well," the old woman said, to no one in particular, though Nandi understood the words were meant for her. "I had good teachers," Nandi said, glancing back at her. "You had one good teacher," the grandmother said, with the faintest trace of something that might have been amusement. "I simply stayed out of the way long enough to watch you become your own." Jae-hyun took Nandi's hand as they walked down the steps together, the estate's guards straightening along the drive as they passed. Not out of fear this time, Nandi noticed, but out of something closer to the quiet respect men show a leader they've already decided, in the privacy of their own judgment, to follow. She didn't look back at the house as they reached the car. She had spent 3 years looking back at that house, waiting for it to finally see her clearly, and she understood now, climbing into the seat beside her husband as the engine turned over, that she had no further need of its permission, only, from this evening forward, its obedience. In the weeks that followed, the family sorted itself, as families do, into the ones willing to bend and the ones who weren't. Uncle Byung-chul stayed, quietly, having decided somewhere in the space of those 3 days that an old man's pride was worth less to him than the chance to watch his grandchildren grow up in a house that wasn't quietly bankrupting itself in secret, and he became, in time, one of the few voices at the new table Nandi actually trusted to disagree with her honestly. Mireille did not stay. She left within the month, her severance calculated to the exact figure the courts would have considered fair, and not a single won beyond it. And Nandi heard, second-hand and without much interest, that she'd moved to a smaller apartment across the city, and complained, to anyone who would listen, about a woman who had ruined a family that had, in fact, mostly ruined itself, long before she'd ever arrived to save it. Madame Yoon left the estate the following week, exactly as she'd been told to, in a car considerably smaller than the ones she'd been driven in for 40 years, taking with her only what genuinely belonged to her, which turned out, once the lawyers had finished sorting personal property from family assets, to be considerably less than she had ever imagined it would be. She did not send word to Jae-hyun once she'd settled, wherever she settled, and he did not go looking for it, and Nandi found in the months that followed that she thought of her mother-in-law far less often than she'd once assumed she would. Not out of spite withheld, but simply because a house finally run on its own terms had very little room left over for grievances that no longer had anywhere to live. Sometimes, in the quiet months that followed, Nandi would find herself standing at the same tall glass doors where the guards had once walked her out into the storm, watching ordinary rain fall over ordinary hills, and she would think, without any bitterness left in it, of the woman who had stood in that doorway soaked to the skin and told herself, with every step across the gravel, that she intended to leave exactly the way she'd arrived, upright, unbroken, and entirely her own. She had. It had simply taken the whole house catching fire around her to prove it. If you'd love to see more stories like this, hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to leave a like and a comment.